I am Maya, and 3 weeks ago, at my father's Legend of Design gala, he stood before the most powerful people in the city and attempted to erase me. Imagine the scene. The Grand Ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, smelling of expensive lilies and desperation. 200 guests in charcoal suits and silk gowns, the kind of people who don't just own buildings, they own the skyline. My father, Julian Vane, stood on the stage under a focused white spotlight, clutching a gold-plated award for lifetime achievement in architecture. He'd spent 40 years building a reputation for structural integrity, but in our family, integrity was the first thing he'd demolished. He leaned into the microphone, that practiced, charismatic smile stretching across his face, the one that looks like a blessing to a stranger but feels like a cold blade to anyone who actually knows him. He began introducing the Vane Dynasty. He spoke of his wife, Elena, a woman who wore diamonds like armor. He spoke of my stepbrother, Leo, the future of the firm, a man who couldn't draw a straight line without a ruler and a bribe. Then, his eyes found me. I was sitting at the very back, at a table tucked behind a massive floral arrangement, near the kitchen doors. And of course, Julian said, his voice dropping into a tone of mock pity that silenced the room, my daughter, Maya. Our resident, starving artist. No blueprints, no legacy, just a wandering soul living off the family's grace. But hey, at least she's here to see what real work looks like. Cheers to the hobbyists, everyone. 200 people laughed. It wasn't a roar, it was a polite, high society titter, the sound of crystal clinking against silk. I didn't flinch. I didn't feel the heat rise in my cheeks. I just looked at him, the man who had spent a decade trying to convince the world I was a ghost. I stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. I raised my glass of sparkling water, I wanted to be stone-cold sober for this, and met his gaze across the sea of tuxedos. To the legacy you think you built, I said. My voice wasn't a scream, but in that silent room, it echoed like a gunshot. This is the last time any of you will ever see me. And Dad? Enjoy the view from the top while you still recognize the horizon. I set the glass down. It made a sharp, definitive thud on the linen. Then, I turned and walked out. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the suffocating smell of lilies and lies. The room was deathly quiet. They thought they had just witnessed a daughter's public breakdown. They thought the unstable one had finally snapped. What they didn't know was that I wasn't leaving because I was hurt. I was leaving because I was done being the silent foundation for a house that was about to fall. Before the night was over, Julian Vane would realize that the hobbyist he just ridiculed was the only person keeping his empire from collapsing into the dirt. But to understand how we got to that ballroom, you have to understand the day the blueprint of my life was torn to pieces. They say architecture is the art of how we waste space. In the Vane family, I was the empty space. 10 years ago, I was 21, a senior at the most prestigious architecture program in the country. I lived in the studio. I slept on a cot between drafting tables. I had a 4.0 GPA and a portfolio that had already caught the eye of firms in London and Tokyo. I wasn't just Julian Vane's daughter, I was his successor. Or so I thought. I remember the Tuesday he called me home. The Vane estate, in Greenwich, was a masterpiece of glass and steel, perched on a cliffside like a predatory bird. My father was in his library, surrounded by leather-bound books he never read and models of skyscrapers he'd taken the credit for but never actually engineered. Elena was there, too, standing by the window with a glass of sherry. She wasn't my mother. My mother had died when I was 7, taking the warmth of the house with her. Elena was a woman of logistics. She saw people as assets or liabilities. Maya, my father started, not looking up from a site plan. We've had to make some executive decisions regarding the family's future. Leo has been accepted into the Global Executive MBA program in Paris. It's an essential step for him to take over the firm's leadership. I stood there, my backpack still on my shoulder, feeling a cold dread settle in my stomach. That's great for Leo. But what does that have to do with me? The firm is navigating a temporary liquidity crunch, Elena interjected, her voice like honey poured over gravel. High-end design is a volatile market, darling. We can't justify the expense of 2 elite tuitions right now. We've decided you'll take a sabbatical. You can work in the firm's archives for a year or 2. A girl with your eye for color doesn't really need a professional license to have a comfortable life, anyway. The room felt like it was losing oxygen. A sabbatical? Dad, I'm 3 months from graduation. I have a fellowship waiting in London. You promised Mom before she passed that my education was sacred. My father finally looked up. His eyes were like flint. Circumstances change, Maya. Leo is the face of the Vane name. You're talented, but you're a supporting player. Once the firm stabilizes, we'll see about finishing your little degree. For now, be a team player. I didn't cry. I had learned early on that tears in that house were treated as structural weaknesses. I later found out, through a discarded bank statement I found in the trash, that there was no liquidity crunch. Julian had just bought a vintage Aston Martin and Elena had commissioned a portrait that cost more than my entire 4-year tuition. They weren't choosing the firm. They were choosing Leo. They were choosing to bury me so that he could stand on my shoulders and look tall. That night, I packed a single suitcase. I didn't take the jewelry they'd bought me or the designer clothes that felt like a costume. I took my drafting tools, my mother's old sketches, and the $300 I'd hidden in the lining of my mattress. I left a note on the mahogany dining table. It had 4 words, check the foundation, Dad. I moved to the city, the parts of the city they never visited. I lived in a walk-up above a 24-hour tire shop where the air tasted like rubber and exhaust. I worked 3 jobs. I served coffee at 5 a.m., filed papers for a bankrupt developer at noon, and spent my nights in the basement of the public library, teaching myself the coding and structural software that the university wouldn't let me finish learning. For 10 years, I was a ghost. I changed my last name. I stopped looking at the society pages. I became Maya Thorne, a name that sounded like something sharp and hard to pull out. I was building something in the dark, something they couldn't see, because they were too busy looking at the Vane name on the skyline. I didn't know then that the very thing they stole from me, my visibility, would become the weapon I'd use to dismantle them. Welcome to the heart of the ghost. I live and work in a converted industrial loft in the meatpacking district. It's not the glass palace I grew up in. It's a space of exposed brick, humming servers, and floor-to-ceiling monitors. This is the headquarters of Aura Analytics. On paper, Aura Analytics is a behind-the-scenes consulting firm. We don't build buildings. We build the math that makes the buildings possible. In the modern world of architecture, nobody draws on napkins anymore. They use high-level algorithms to test wind resistance, light refraction, and structural load. And for the last 5 years, Aura Analytics has been the silent brain behind Vane and Associates. It started small. My father's firm was struggling with the transition to digital engineering. They were old school, arrogant, and falling behind. Through an intermediary, I offered them a service contract. I knew exactly how they worked. I knew Julian's shortcuts and Leo's incompetence. I created a shadow firm that would do the heavy lifting for them, anonymously. Julian Vane thinks he has been winning awards for his visionary use of geometric glass. In reality, every single one of those glass panels was calculated, positioned, and stress-tested by my team in this loft. My CFO, a brilliant, tight-lipped man named Marcus, handles all the communications. My father has never heard my voice on a conference call. He has never seen my face on a Zoom meeting. He thinks he's dealing with a high-end tech collective in Silicon Valley. He calls my firm the Engine. He told an industry magazine last year that Vane and Associates has successfully outsourced its technical burdens to a secondary tier, allowing the true artists, myself and Leo, to focus on the soul of the structure. He was calling his own daughter a secondary tier without even knowing it. Today, the loft is vibrating with a different kind of energy. The monitors are glowing with the blueprints for the Meridian, a 100-story residential tower in the heart of the city. It's Julian's magnum opus. It's the project he's staking the entire Vane reputation on. But there's a secret buried in those digital files. A secret I've been holding like a jagged stone. Maya, Marcus says, walking over to my desk with a tablet in hand. He looks worried. The renewal documents just came in from Vane's legal team. They're offering a 5-year extension with a 20% premium. They're desperate. They know that if we don't finalize the structural simulations for the Meridian by the end of the month, the city will pull their permits. I look at the screen. I see the Vane logo, the interlocking V I used to draw in my notebooks as a child. They don't just want the tech, Marcus, I say, my voice low. They need us to sign off on the safety certifications. Leo is the lead architect on record, but he can't even read the stress test data. If we walk away, the magnum opus becomes a pile of scrap metal. Are we walking? Marcus asks. I don't answer. I look out the window at the city skyline. I can see 3 buildings from here that my father claims he built. I know every bolt, every weld, and every flaw in those structures. I've been his silent partner, his invisible support beam, his secret backbone. But as I reach for the renewal file, my eyes catch on a small, weathered envelope sitting on the corner of my desk. It arrived this morning from my family's old lawyer, a woman who hasn't spoken to me in a decade. The return address is a cemetery office. My Aunt Elena, my father's sister and the only person who ever looked at me like I was a person and not an obstacle, died 2 years ago. I thought she'd left me nothing but a broken heart. But the letter inside that envelope suggests she left me a blueprint of a very different kind. A blueprint that proves Julian Vane didn't just take my future. He might have stolen my past, too. Marcus watches me. Maya? Is everything okay? I tuck the envelope into my pocket, the paper crisp and cold against my leg. The renewal is on hold, Marcus. I need to take a trip to a graveyard. It turns out, I'm not the only one who's been keeping secrets in this family. The air at St. Jude's Cemetery doesn't move. It sits heavy, smelling of damp earth and the kind of silence that only exists when the living stop trying to explain themselves to the dead. I stood before Aunt Elena's headstone, a simple, elegant slab of gray granite that looked far too modest for a woman who had spent her life navigating the jagged ego of my father. She was the only one who didn't look through me like a window. She was the only one who saw the architect in the girl who was being told to stay in the kitchen. I pulled the envelope from my coat pocket. The paper felt brittle, like a dry leaf ready to shatter. Inside was a key, old-fashioned, heavy brass, and a single sheet of stationery with Elena's looping, graceful script. Maya, it read, they will tell you that I left you nothing. They will tell you that I agreed with your father's vision for the family. They are lying. Build the walls they tried to trap you in. The safety deposit box at First National is yours. Use the blueprint I left you. It took 40 minutes to reach the bank. The vault was a subterranean fortress of cold steel and flickering fluorescent lights. When the clerk slid the long metal box onto the viewing table and left me alone, my hands were shaking. I expected jewelry. I expected a formal apology. I didn't expect a ledger. It was a thick, leather-bound book titled The Margaret Vane Trust. My mother's name. I opened it, and the world tilted. This wasn't just a savings account. It was a war chest. Elena had spent a decade secretly funneling her own dividends into this trust, but that wasn't the hard hit. The real blow came on page 42. A notarized document, dated 2 weeks before my mother's death. She had established a $500,000 education fund specifically for me. Not for the children. For Maya. The ledger showed the withdrawal. $500,000, taken out on the exact day I was told I had to drop out of university. The recipient wasn't the registrar. It was a private debt-holding company. I didn't need a detective to tell me whose name was on those debts. My father had reached into my mother's grave, stolen my future, and handed it to Leo to pay off a liquidity crunch that was actually a gambling addiction. Elena had spent the rest of her life trying to replace what Julian had stolen. The trust now held nearly $800,000. But as I stared at the numbers, I realized the money wasn't the gift. The gift was the clarity. My father didn't just overlook me. He didn't just underestimate me. He actively dismantled me to keep his preferred structure standing. He used my mother's love for me to fund the son who was destined to fail. I closed the ledger. The sound echoed in the small vault like a judge's gavel. For 10 years, I had been running on the fuel of proving them wrong. But standing there in the cold belly of the bank, that fuel changed. It wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about making sure that the walls they built with my stolen bricks were the first ones to crumble. I wasn't just a ghost anymore. I was a structural failure they never saw coming. Let's talk about the anatomy of an empire. Julian Vane likes to tell the press that Vane and Associates is built on traditional values and cutting-edge courage. He's half right. It's built on a lie, and the cutting edge belongs to me. Back in my loft, the atmosphere has shifted from professional to predatory. Aura Analytics isn't just a consulting firm today, it's a siege engine. For 5 years, I have been the invisible CEO, the shadow in the server room. My father thinks the engine is a high-tech collective of faceless engineers in San Francisco. He thinks he's paying for a service. He doesn't realize he's been paying his own executioner to build the scaffold. 60%. That's the number. 60% of the projects Vane and Associates has won in the last half-decade, the museums, the glass-wrapped corporate hubs, the boutique hotels, were actually designed by us. My team takes Julian's napkin sketches, which are usually structurally impossible and aesthetically dated, and we optimize them. We fix the load-bearing errors. We redesign the facade for wind shear. We turn his fantasies into reality, and then we let him sign his name on the bottom. But the Meridian is different. The Meridian is a 100-story needle of titanium and glass. It's the tallest residential tower ever attempted in this city. It is Julian's ticket to immortality and Leo's proof of concept as the new CEO. And right now, it's a ghost. I sat at my terminal, the blue light of the architectural renders reflecting in my eyes. Without Aura's final structural sign-off, the Meridian is legally a pile of very expensive trash. The city's Department of Buildings won't issue the final construction permit without the digital integrity certification that only we can provide. Maya, Marcus said, leaning over my shoulder. Vane's CFO has called 5 times in the last hour. He's offering to double the premium. He says Julian is personally insulted by our silence. Let him be insulted, I replied, my fingers flying across the keys. Insult is the only thing he's ever given for free. I pulled up the master file for the Meridian. I looked at the core load simulations. It was a masterpiece of engineering, my masterpiece. If I hit send, Julian Vane becomes a god of the skyline. If I hit delete, he becomes a punchline in a bankruptcy court. But I'm not going to delete it. Not yet. There's a specific kind of suspense in architecture called pre-stress. It's when you apply tension to a structure before it ever has to carry a load, making it stronger in the long run. My father taught me that. Now, I'm applying it to him. I'm letting the silence stretch. I'm letting the deadlines at the city office turn from yellow to red. I want him to feel the ground shake. I want him to look at that empty lot on 57th Street and realize that his legacy is currently sitting on a hard drive in a loft he's never visited, owned by a daughter he told the world was a freeloading failure. He thinks he's a king waiting for his crown. He doesn't know he's a man standing on a trapdoor, and I'm the only one with my hand on the lever. The noose is tightening, and Julian Vane is finally starting to choke. In the world of logistics and high-stakes construction, time isn't money. Time is a weapon. Every hour that passes without the Meridian certification costs Vane and Associates $50,000 in holding fees, equipment rentals, and liquidated damages. By my count, they've lost nearly $1 million since I left the gala. But it's not just about the money. It's about the panic. My monitors are a window into their world. Because we manage their cloud-based project servers, I can see the internal memos flying back and forth. I see the frantic emails from the bank. I see the board members demanding to know why the most prestigious firm in the country is being ghosted by a tech collective. And then, I saw the memo that made my blood run cold. It was an internal Vane directive, authored by Leo. Subject: Aura Analytics Ownership Investigation. They weren't just calling Marcus anymore. They were digging. They'd hired a private security firm to do a deep dive into Aura's incorporation papers. They were looking for a face to scream at. They were looking for a way to sue us into submission. "They're getting close, Maya," Marcus warned, his voice tight with an anxiety he usually hides. "They've tracked our legal representation back to Eleanor Smith's firm. If they realize you're the one behind the curtain, Julian won't just negotiate. He'll go to war. He'll claim you've been sabotaging the family business from the inside." "Let him try," I said, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. Sabotage requires intent to harm. I haven't harmed a thing. I've provided 5 years of flawless service. I'm simply choosing not to renew a contract with a client who publicly slandered me. That's not sabotage. That's the free market. "But the Meridian," Marcus pressed. "The city won't wait forever. If the permits expire, the investors can trigger a force majeure clause and pull their funding. It would bankrupt Vane and Associates in a weekend." I stared at the rendering of the tower. It looked like a silver shard piercing the clouds. It was beautiful. And it was a cage. I reached for my phone. It was time to stop being a ghost and start being a person. I didn't call my father. I called the one person who I knew would be the weak link in the Vane chain. "Leo," I said when he picked up on the third ring. The background noise was a frantic mess of office chatter and shouting. "Maya?" His voice was a mixture of shock and immediate, reflexive anger. "Where the hell have you been? Dad is losing his mind." "The gala." "I don't care about the gala, Leo. And I don't care about Dad's mind. I'm calling because I have the Meridian certifications on my desk." There was a sudden, deafening silence on the other end. I could hear his breathing, heavy and ragged. "What? How do you?" "I own Aura Analytics, Leo. I am the engine." I let the words hang there, a structural load he wasn't built to carry. "You're lying," he hissed, but the tremor in his voice told me he already knew it was the truth. "You're a failure. You're a starving artist living in a..." "I'm the person holding the pen to your future," I interrupted. "And right now, I'm looking at the ledger for our mother's trust. I'm looking at the $500,000 Dad stole from my education to pay off your debts 10 years ago." I could hear a door slam on his end. He was alone now. "Maya, listen," he started, his tone shifting to that oily, manipulative charm he'd perfected. "We can fix this. Dad doesn't have to know you've been playing this game. Just send the certifications, and I'll make sure you get a seat at the table. A real one this time. I don't want a seat at your table, Leo. I want the truth. And I want you to tell Dad that I'm coming for the keys to the house he built with my mother's money." I hung up. I stood there, shaking, the adrenaline coursing through me like high-voltage current. I had finally stepped out of the shadows. I had declared war on the giants. But as I looked at the screen, a new notification popped up. It wasn't an email. It was an alert from my loft security system. Someone was in the lobby. Someone who didn't wait for the elevator. Someone who was override coding the service stairs. And they weren't alone. The silence in the loft was replaced by the rhythmic, metallic thud of the service stairs. My security monitor flickered, showing 3 silhouettes ascending with a purpose that didn't belong to a social visit. I didn't need to see their faces to know the scent of the storm. Elena, my stepmother, was leading the charge, her designer heels clicking against the industrial steel like a countdown. Behind her, 2 men in charcoal suits. The kind of fixers my father kept on retainer for when blueprints turned into legal battles. They didn't knock. Elena used a master override code that only someone with deep connections to the building's original developers could possess. She stepped into my workspace, her eyes doing a rapid, predatory sweep of the server racks, the drafting monitors, and finally, me. She looked at my black turtleneck, my messily tied hair, and the sheer scale of the operation I was running. For a second, the mask of concerned mother slipped, replaced by a raw, naked calculation. Maya, she said, her voice dropping into that familiar register that always preceded a betrayal. You've certainly been busy. Living in this rustic environment, playing with your little computers. We've been so worried about your mental state since the gala. Running away like that, cutting off your phone. It's a classic symptom of a breakdown, darling. I didn't rise from my chair. I leaned back, letting the blue light of the meridian renders frame me. A breakdown? Is that the narrative you've settled on, Elena? It's a bit uninspired, don't you think? You used the unstable daughter card 10 years ago to justify stealing my tuition. You might want to refresh your portfolio. One of the men behind her stepped forward, a leather portfolio in his hand. Miss Vane, I'm Mr. Sterling, counsel for Vane and Associates. We've been authorized to discuss the immediate transfer of the Meridian Digital Integrity certifications. We understand there's been a misunderstanding regarding the ownership of Aura Analytics. We're here to help you resolve this quietly before your condition becomes a matter of public record. The threat was as clear as a glass facade. They weren't here to negotiate, they were here to gaslight. If I didn't hand over the keys to the empire, they would use my disappearance and my behavior to petition for a conservatorship. They would claim I wasn't fit to run a business, seize Aura's assets, and sign the certifications themselves while I was locked away in a wellness retreat in upstate New York. My condition is perfectly fine, Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice steady enough to cut diamond. In fact, I've never seen more clearly. I see a firm that is 48 hours away from a catastrophic permit expiration. I see a CEO who can't explain why his lead architect hasn't produced a single stress test in 5 years. And I see a woman who thinks she can still treat me like furniture. Elena stepped closer, the smell of her expensive perfume clashing with the ozone of the servers. Maya, don't be a fool. You're playing a high-stakes game with people who own the judges in this city. Your father is willing to overlook this little rebellion. He'll even put you on a generous allowance. But the Meridian stays with the Vanes. It's our blood. It's our name. It's my mother's money, I hissed, finally standing. The height difference was minimal, but the power dynamic had shifted. I know about the trust, Elena. I know Julian drained it to pay for Leo's failures. You didn't just take my education, you took the only thing she had left to give me. So here is my counteroffer. Get out of my loft. And tell Julian that if he wants those certifications, he'll have to come here and look me in the eye himself. Elena's face contorted, the beauty stripping away to reveal the iron beneath. You think you're a player, Maya? You're a bug on a windshield. We'll have an injunction on this office by morning. You won't be able to turn on a light bulb without our permission. She turned on her heel, her fixers following like shadows. As the heavy door slammed shut, Marcus stepped out from behind a partition, his face pale. They're going for the nuclear option, Maya. They're going to try to declare you incompetent. Let them try, I said, reaching for my mother's ledger. They think they're the only ones who know how to build a case. But they forgot one thing, I've been watching them from inside their own walls for 5 years. I don't just have their blueprints. I have their sins. The boardrooms of Vane and Associates are designed to make you feel small. They are 60 floors up, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass that makes the rest of the world look like a toy set. I used to think the height was about the view. Now I realize it's about the distance between the people who make the decisions and the people who have to live with the consequences. While Elena was playing the heavy in my loft, Julian Vane was facing a different kind of architectural collapse. I sat in my dark office, monitoring the internal feed of the Vane executive suite. They didn't realize that my service contract included a backdoor into their security cameras. I watched Julian pacing the length of the mahogany table. He looked older, the crisp lines of his suit failing to hide the sag in his shoulders. Leo sat at the far end, staring at his phone, his leg bouncing with a nervous energy that signaled a man who knew the floor was about to give way. "Where is she?" Julian roared, his voice distorted by the small speaker on my desk. "Elena said she'd have the signatures. The investors are calling every 20 minutes. The bank is threatening to freeze the construction draw." "Dad, she's crazy," Leo muttered, not looking up. "She's been running this shadow company for years, spying on us. She's probably been sabotaging the Meridian from day one. We should just call the police. It's corporate espionage." "Espionage?" Julian stopped and glared at his son. "She is the firm, you idiot. I just spent 3 hours reviewing the technical logs. Every major project we've finished since you took over the lead role has her digital fingerprint on it. If we call the police, we're admitting that Vane and Associates is a hollow shell. We're admitting that you are a fraud." I watched Leo flinch. It was the first time I'd ever heard my father speak the truth about his golden boy. The structural integrity of the Vane family was finally reaching its breaking point. "We have to buy her out," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, desperate hiss. "Whatever she wants. Money, credit, a partnership. We swallow our pride, we get the Meridian through the permit phase, and then we deal with her." "She knows about the trust, Dad," Leo said quietly. The silence that followed was heavy. Julian sat down slowly, his hands flat on the table. "The theft of my mother's money wasn't just a family secret anymore, it was a liability. In the world of high-end architecture, reputation is a fragile thing. A CEO caught stealing from his deceased wife's daughter to cover a son's gambling debts? That's the kind of scandal that doesn't just lose clients, it loses legacies." "Then we don't buy her out with money," Julian whispered. "We buy her out with a choice. We give her the one thing she's always wanted, and then we make sure she can never use it against us." I turned off the feed. I didn't need to hear the rest. I knew my father's choices. They were always traps disguised as opportunities. I looked at the clock. It was 3 a.m. In 6 hours, the city's permit office would open. In 12 hours, the Meridian project would either be the greatest success in the city's history or the largest bankruptcy in the history of the firm. But I had a third option. I spent the rest of the night drafting a different kind of document. It wasn't a certification. It wasn't a resignation. It was a blueprint for an exit that would leave me standing and the Vane name in ruins. My phone buzzed on the desk. A text from an unknown number. "I'm downstairs. Alone. No lawyers. No Elena. Let's talk like architects." It was my father. The giant had finally come to the ghost's door. There is a specific kind of silence that happens between two people who know exactly how they've hurt each other. Julian Vane stood in the center of my loft, looking at the exposed pipes and the humming server racks. He didn't look like the legend of design anymore. He looked like a man who had spent too much time building monuments to himself and not enough time checking the soil they were standing on. He walked over to a drafting table and ran a finger over a 3D printed model of the Meridian. "It's good work, Maya," he said, his voice devoid of the theatricality he used for the public. "The light refraction on the north-facing atrium. I couldn't figure out why the simulations were failing. You used a double-curved lattice. It's brilliant. Expensive, but brilliant." "I used math, Dad," I said, staying in the shadows near my desk. "Something you stopped doing 20 years ago when you realized it was easier to be a celebrity than an engineer." He turned to face me. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. "You've spent 5 years building my company while I thought I was doing it myself. Why? If you hated me this much, why didn't you just let us fail years ago?" "Because I didn't want the buildings to fail," I said, stepping into the light. "The people who live in those structures deserve to be safe, even if the man who signed the blueprints is a liar. And because I wanted to see if you'd ever notice. I wanted to see if the great Julian Vane could recognize his own daughter's genius if her name wasn't on the bill. And I didn't, he admitted. I saw the results, and I assumed I had hired the best in the world. It turns out, I had. I just didn't realize I'd raised her. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a leather portfolio. He set it on the table between us. Elena wants to go to court. She wants to claim you're mentally unfit. Leo wants to bury you in lawsuits. But I know you, Maya. I know that if we go to war, the meridian falls. And I can't let that happen. I looked at the portfolio. What is that? A full confession, he said. The truth about your mother's trust. The documentation of the funds I took. The records of how Aura Analytics has been the primary engineering lead for Vane and Associates for 5 years. It's everything you'd need to destroy me. My heart skipped a beat. This was the hard hit I'd been waiting for, but it felt wrong. It felt too easy. Why give this to me? Because I'm retiring, he said, and for the first time, he looked me directly in the eyes. Officially. Effectively immediately. I'm stepping down, and I'm naming you as the successor. Vane and Associates becomes Thorn and Vane. You get the firm. You get the meridian. You get the legacy. All you have to do is sign the certifications and keep the secret. Leo and Elena get a payout, and they disappear. You win, Maya. You get everything they tried to take from you. I stared at the portfolio. The keys to the kingdom. The power to finally stand in the light, to have my name on the skyline, to own the firm that had tried to erase me. It was the ultimate success. It was the perfect revenge. I reached out and touched the leather. It felt cold. You're giving me the firm because it's the only way to save yourself, I realized. If I'm the CEO, I can't sue the company for the stolen trust without suing myself. If I'm the successor, I have to protect the Vane name to protect my own future. You're not giving me a legacy, Dad. You're giving me a cage built out of my own ambition. Julian smiled, a small, sad flick of the lips. Every legacy is a cage, Maya. That's what architecture is. We build boxes and we tell people it's art. But you're the only one who can keep this box from collapsing. What's it going to be? Do you want to be a ghost in a loft, or the woman who owns the city? I looked from him to the glowing render of the meridian. The city was waking up. The first light of dawn was hitting the silver shard of the tower, making it look like a beacon. I have the third option, Dad, I said, picking up the portfolio. The one you didn't plan for. I walked over to my main server and plugged in a drive. What are you doing? Julian asked, his voice sharpening with a sudden, panicked edge. I'm sending a message, I said. But it's not to the permit office. Just as my finger hovered over the enter key, the security monitor behind my father erupted into a grid of red alerts. The front door of the loft didn't just open. It was kicked in. But it wasn't the police. And it wasn't Elena. It was Leo, and he was holding something in his hand that didn't look like a legal document. Leo didn't look like the polished heir to a design dynasty anymore. His bespoke suit was rumpled, his tie missing, and his eyes were bloodshot with a frantic, cornered energy. In his right hand, he wasn't holding a subpoena or a settlement. He was holding a heavy, industrial-grade flare gun he'd snatched from the building's emergency cache. Back away from the server, Maya, he rasped, his voice cracking. Dad, get away from her. She's not taking the firm. She's not taking anything. Julian stood frozen between us, his hands raised in a universal gesture of de-escalation. Leo, put that down. We're settling this. I'm naming her successor. It's the only way to save the meridian. Save the meridian? Leo laughed, a high, jagged sound that grated against the hum of the servers. You're giving her my life. You're giving the ghost the keys because you're afraid of a little scandal. I've spent 10 years being the face of this family while she hid in the shadows. I'm the CEO. Not her. Never her. I kept my hand hovering over the enter key. The blue light of the monitor cast long, distorted shadows across the brick walls. Leo, you were never the CEO. You were the mascot. I've been doing your job since you were failing out of your MBA. If you pull that trigger, you don't just destroy this loft. You destroy the only digital copies of the Meridian's structural integrity. You'll be the man who burned down a 100-story legacy before the first brick was even laid. I don't care about the bricks anymore. Leo stepped closer, the smell of sweat and expensive bourbon rolling off him. If I can't have the name, nobody can. You think you're so smart, Maya? You think you're the engine? Let's see how well you run when the engine room is on fire. The air in the loft felt pressurized, like the moment before a structural failure. I looked at my father. For the first time in my life, I saw him looking at his son with absolute, unfiltered clarity. He wasn't seeing the future of the Vane name. He was seeing the monster his own neglect and favoritism had built. Leo, listen to me, Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding rumble. If you do this, there is no way back. The police are already on their way because of the security trip. If you walk out now, we can spin this. We can say it was a misunderstanding. But if you fire that, you're done. I will disown you myself. You already did. Leo screamed. The second you walked into this loft to beg her for help, you disowned me. I saw his finger tighten on the trigger. In architecture, there's a concept called total collapse. It's when a single failure point leads to the immediate and irreversible destruction of the entire system. We were at that point. The Vane family wasn't just cracking, it was imploding. I'm sending the message, Leo, I said, my voice a whisper of steel. But it's not the one you think. I hit the key. The monitors didn't turn red. They didn't show us sent confirmation for the Meridian. Instead, every screen in the loft began to scroll through the personal letter I'd drafted. It was a digital manifesto, a portfolio of every lie, every stolen dollar, and every secret design I'd ever created. The flare gun didn't go off. Leo stared at the screens, the orange plastic trembling in his grip. He watched his own gambling debts scroll past in high definition. He watched the video of our father's gala speech juxtaposed with the engineering logs that proved he was a fraud. It's not just in this loft, Leo, I said. It's on the cloud. It's being BCC'd to every major architectural journal in the country as we speak. You can burn the building, but you can't burn the truth. Leo's arm dropped. The flare gun hit the floor with a dull thud. He sank to his knees, the weight of a decade of lies finally proving to be a load he couldn't carry. Julian looked at the screens, then at me, then at his broken son. The giant was finally small. The aftermath of a demolition is never clean. There is always dust, always rubble, and always the strange, ringing silence that follows the crash. I stood in the center of my loft, watching the sunrise over a city that felt entirely different than it had 24 hours ago. The police had come and gone. Leo had been taken into custody. Elena had vanished the moment the digital manifesto hit the news cycle, likely heading for a non-extradition country with whatever jewelry she could fit in a Birkin bag. Julian Vane sat at my drafting table, staring at the leather portfolio he'd brought me. He hadn't left. He looked like a man who had survived a shipwreck only to realize he'd forgotten how to swim. You did it, he said, his voice hollow. The Meridian is dead. The firm is under emergency investigation by the Board of Architecture. The name Vane is synonymous with fraud on every news channel from here to London. I didn't do it, Dad, I said, pouring 2 cups of cold coffee. You did it 10 years ago. I just stopped hiding the damage. You can't build a 100-story tower on a foundation of theft and expect it to stand forever. Engineering doesn't work that way. Life doesn't work that way. He looked up at me, and for a second, I saw a flash of the man he might have been if he hadn't been so obsessed with his own shadow. What now? You have the money. You have the truth. You have the starving artist's revenge. Are you happy, Maya? I'm not happy, I admitted. I'm tired. I've spent 10 years being a ghost, and 3 weeks being an executioner. Neither of those roles leaves much room for happiness. I walked over to the main monitor. The render of the meridian was still there, glowing like a silver dream. The firm is gone, Julian. Thorne and Vane will never happen. I don't want your legacy. I don't want to spend the rest of my life polishing the brass on a sinking ship. Then what was the point? He asked. The point was the truth, I said. But there's one more truth you haven't heard. The one Aunt Elena left for me in the vault. I pulled out the leather-bound ledger, the one that contained the real history of the Margaret Vane Trust. I opened it to the very last page, a section I hadn't shown him yet. You think you stole $500,000 from my education, I said. And you did. But you didn't look at the fine print of the trust's original charter. My mother knew you, Julian. She knew your ego, and she knew your weaknesses. She didn't just set up a fund for my school. I slid the ledger toward him. She set up a succession contingency. If you ever touched the principal of that trust for anything other than my direct benefit, the ownership of the Greenwich estate and the land the Vane headquarters stands on automatically reverts to me. Legally. Irrevocably. Julian's face went white. He grabbed the ledger, his eyes scanning the legal jargon with a desperate intensity. No. That's not, she wouldn't have. She loved you, but she didn't trust you, I said. She knew that one day, you'd try to erase me to save yourself. So she built a safety net that would catch me and trap you at the same time. I leaned over the table, my shadow falling across him. I don't just have your reputation, Dad. I have your house. I have your office. I have every square inch of dirt you think you own. The silence in the loft was absolute. The man who had spent his life building monuments was realizing he was a tenant in his own empire. In architecture, there is a concept called creative destruction. Sometimes, you have to tear down a perfectly functional building because the land it sits on is capable of so much more. I spent the next 48 hours in a blur of legal meetings and press statements. I didn't hide. I didn't play the victim. I stood in front of the cameras and I told the truth. I told them about the shadow engineering. I told them about the stolen trust. And I told them that Vane and Associates was being liquidated. The response was a firestorm. The architectural world was rocked to its core. But amidst the chaos, something strange happened. The clients, the people whose buildings I'd secretly saved for 5 years, didn't walk away. They didn't want the Vane name, but they wanted the engine. Maya, Marcus said, walking into my office with a stack of files that looked different from the Vane blue. The shipping executive from the gala, he just called. He doesn't care about the scandal. He says if you're the one who actually designed the port terminal in Singapore, he wants you to lead his new project in Dubai. No intermediaries. Just you. I looked at the files. They were new contracts. Clean ones. Contracts for Maya Thorne, not a ghost. But as I started to review the terms, I realized that the big reveal wasn't over. My mother's ledger had one more secret, one that Aunt Elena had highlighted in yellow ink on the very last day of her life. It was a small, hand-drawn map of the Greenwich estate. It pointed to a section of the basement, beneath the original foundation stones laid in the 1920s. There was a notation in my mother's handwriting, the real archive. Where the shadows began. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. My father hadn't just stolen my tuition. He hadn't just used the firm for his ego. There was something else buried in the history of the Vane family, something that explained why he was so terrified of me becoming a real architect. I looked at Julian, who was currently being escorted out of his office by a team of liquidators. He looked at me, and for a brief second, the mask of the fallen giant slipped. He didn't look sad. He looked guilty. Not for the money. For something much, much older. Dad, I said, catching him near the elevator. "What's in the basement in Greenwich?" He stopped. His hand went to the elevator button, but he didn't press it. He didn't look at me. He just stared at his own reflection in the polished chrome doors. "Some blueprints are better left unread, Maya," he whispered. "You think you've won? You've just started digging your own grave." The elevator doors opened, and he was gone. I stood there, the ledger heavy in my hand. I had the firm. I had the truth. I had my freedom. But as I looked at the hand-drawn map, I realized I was holding the key to a door I wasn't sure I was ready to open. Because if my father was this afraid of the basement, then the story of Maya Vane didn't start with a gala toast. It started with a crime that was still hidden in the stone. The basement of the Greenwich estate doesn't feel like a part of a home. It feels like a bunker. The air down here is recycled and thin, stripped of the scent of the salt air from the cliffs above. I held the heavy brass key Aunt Elena had left me, my thumb tracing the worn grooves. According to the map in the ledger, the real archive wasn't behind the wine cellar or the gym. It was behind a seamless panel of reinforced concrete in the mechanical room. A space designed by my father to be invisible to anyone who didn't know how to read a load-bearing wall. I pressed the release. The panel didn't swing, it slid on silent industrial tracks, revealing a room that smelled of old vellum and ozone. This was Julian Vane's private sanctuary. There were no awards here. No mahogany desks. Just steel filing cabinets and a drafting table that looked older than I was. I began to pull the drawers. I expected more evidence of financial fraud. I expected offshore accounts. What I found was a series of blueprints for the most famous buildings in the Vane portfolio, projects that predated my birth. But the names on the title blocks weren't Julian Vane. They weren't even Vane and Associates. The name on the original drawings was Margaret Thorne. My mother. I sank into the drafting stool, my breath hitching in the quiet dark. I looked at the Vane International Center, the building that had made my father a household name in the 80s. The original sketches, the structural calculations, the revolutionary cantilever system, it was all her. Every stroke of the pen, every brilliant, daring calculation was in her hand. Julian hadn't just stolen my tuition. He hadn't just stolen the firm's current success from Aura Analytics. He had built his entire legend on the stolen genius of the woman he claimed to love. He had married his greatest competitor, buried her career in a supportive marriage, and then, when she died, he'd scrubbed her name from the history of architecture. He didn't want me to be an architect because he was terrified I'd look at his early work and recognize my mother's voice. He wasn't protecting the family name from my failure, he was protecting his lie from my talent. I found a personal journal tucked behind the files. The last entry was dated 3 days before she died. "Julian is terrified of the new designs," she wrote. "He says they are too Thorne and not Vane enough. He wants me to sign over the intellectual property to the firm." I told him no. These are for Maya. This is her inheritance. He thinks I'm weak because I'm sick. He doesn't realize that a foundation built on a secret is a foundation built on sand. I closed the journal. The succession contingency wasn't just a legal trap for the house. It was a recovery mission. My mother had known that one day, I would find this room. She had known that the truth would be the only thing that could truly set me free. Julian Vane wasn't a giant. He was a thief who had spent 40 years living in a house he didn't design, using a name he didn't earn. I gathered the original linens. I took the journal. As I walked out of that cold, dark room, I didn't feel the weight of the Vane name anymore. I felt the strength of the Thorne name. The legend of design was officially dead. And the real architect was finally coming upstairs. The liquidation of Vane and Associates wasn't a funeral. It was an exorcism. I stood in the lobby of the Vane headquarters, a building that now legally belonged to me, and watched as the gold leaf lettering was scraped from the glass doors. The media called it the fall of a dynasty, but as I looked at the new contract sitting on my desk, I knew it was actually a renovation. Julian had retreated to a small cottage in the Hamptons. He was a ghost now, a man whose name had been stripped from the buildings he claimed to own. Leo was in a long-term facility, the pressure of a life built on a lie having finally shattered his mind. Elena was still missing, a footnote in a story that had moved on without her. But the buildings were still standing. And they needed a steward. Maya, Marcus said, stepping into the office. He looked different now. No longer the CFO of a shadow firm, but the partner in a new era. The Board of Architecture has finished their review. They've issued a formal statement. They are acknowledging Margaret Thorne as the primary architect of the Vane portfolio's early years. The historical records are being updated. And the Meridian? I asked. The investors came back, Marcus said, a small smile playing on his lips. They don't want Julian. They don't even want the engine. They want Maya Thorne. They've offered a new contract. Direct ownership of the design rights. You get to finish the tower, Maya. Under your own name. I looked out the window at the empty lot on 57th Street. The cranes were silent, waiting for a command. For 10 years, I had wanted this. I had wanted the light. I had wanted the credit. I had wanted the world to see what I could build. But as I looked at my mother's journal, I realized that success isn't about having your name on the skyline. It's about having the integrity to stand behind the work. I reached for my phone and called the lead developer for the Meridian. I'll sign the contract, I said. But on one condition. We're not building the Silver Shard. The design is flawed. It's too focused on height and not enough on community. I'm submitting a complete redesign. We're going to build something that honors the soil it stands on, not just the ego of the person who paid for it. That will cost millions in redesign fees, Maya, the developer argued. Why bother? Because the foundation matters, I said. And I'm tired of building on sand. The next few months were a blur of creation. I moved Aura Analytics out of the loft and into the top floor of the old Vane building. We renamed it Thorne and Associates. We didn't do shadow engineering anymore. We did the work. My team, the people who had been ghosts with me for 5 years, were now the most sought-after engineers in the city. I didn't do it for revenge. I didn't do it to watch Julian crawl. I did it because I was finally finished with the Vane way of living. I was finished with the secrecy, the gaslighting, and the cold cruelty of a dynasty that saw people as loads to be managed. I was building something new. Not just a tower, but a life. And for the first time, I wasn't drawing the blueprints in the dark. They say that when you're an architect, you live in the future. You spend your days thinking about how a space will feel in 50 years, how the light will hit a corner in a century, how a family will grow within the walls you've imagined. But standing here today, on the observation deck of the newly completed Thorne Tower, I'm finally living in the present. The building isn't a silver shard. It's a terraced, green masterpiece of stone and recycled glass. It breathes. It has public spaces, gardens that hang over the city, and an atrium that is flooded with a light so warm it feels like a blessing. At the very center of the lobby, there is a monument. It isn't a statue of me. It's a simple, beautiful installation of the original blueprints for the Vane International Center, signed by Margaret Thorne. I'm 32 years old. And 3 weeks ago, I decided to erase myself from the Vane family permanently. It was the best decision I ever made. I'm sitting in my office now, the city humming beneath me like a living thing. My phone buzzed a few minutes ago. A message from a blocked number. I already knew who it was. I saw the building on the news, the text read. It looks like her. You win, Maya. I hope the view is worth the cost. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The cost wasn't mine to pay, it was his. He had traded a daughter's love and a wife's legacy for a name on a door that eventually got scraped off. That's a bankruptcy no amount of money can fix. I stood up and walked to the window. I could see the Greenwich estate from here, a tiny speck of glass on a distant cliff. It's a museum now, a foundation for young architects from disadvantaged backgrounds. I donated it last month. I didn't want to live in a house built on a theft, so I turned the theft into a gift. Marcus walked in, holding a fresh set of plans. The Dubai project is ready for sign-off, Maya. And there's a group of students downstairs. They're here for the tour. They want to meet the woman who brought down the giant. I smiled. Tell them the giant didn't fall. He was just a hollow structure that finally met a real wind. And tell them I'll be down in 5 minutes. I picked up my drafting pen, the one my mother had used to change the world in secret. I tucked it into my pocket, a quiet piece of iron that reminded me where I came from and what I was capable of. If you're watching this, if you're listening to my story, I want you to remember one thing. Your worth is not a blueprint drawn by someone else. It's not the name you were given, the money you were denied, or the people who told you that you were furniture. Your worth is the structural integrity of your own soul. They can take your tuition. They can take your credit. They can even try to take your name. But they can never take the math in your head or the fire in your heart. You are the architect of your own life. And if the foundation you were given is rotten, don't be afraid to tear it down and start again. The view from the top is much better when you're standing on a truth you built yourself. I'm Maya Thorne. And I am finally, beautifully, undeniably free.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe Family Files for more.